Hello and welcome to the Einstein Forum. My name is Misha Gabovich. I'm a researcher at the Einstein Forum. And for our first event in the new year, I am very pleased to welcome two of my favorite people in the world, two great friends and two wonderful cultural historians with a broad interdisciplinary outlook. Barak, Associate Professor in the Department of Middle Eastern and African History at Tel Aviv University. Hello.
Hi, Misha. Hi, everybody.
And Alexander Etkind, Mikhail Bakhtin Professor of the History of Russia-Europe Relations at the European University Institute in Florence. Hi.
Hello, everyone. Happy to see you all.
So we are here on your screen today for a conversation inspired by their latest books. Alexander Etkind's Nature's Evil, A Cultural History of Natural Resources, which came out in Russian last year and is forthcoming in English translation with Polity Press. And on Barak's Powering Empire, How Coal Made the Middle East and Sparked Global Carbonization. But since this is not just the Einstein Forum's first event of 2021, but also the inaugural event in a new series titled People, Things, and Animals, let me take 15 minutes at the beginning to introduce that series and talk about how today's discussion fits into it. For the past 30 years or so, thinkers of various backgrounds have ceased seeing humans as privileged subjects of action. We used to treat other creatures and things as a mere background and passive objects of human activity. But increasingly, we have come to recognize their agency and their constitutive role in who we are as humans. We can no longer explain the properties of the universe without referring to dark matter. And similarly, we have realized that human society is merely the tip of an iceberg whose characteristics cannot be understood without reference to its much larger submerged part. Nor are we humans somehow a separate but evenly matched partner, as the formula of man and nature would suggest. The ongoing pandemic, of course, provides a stark illustration of these truths, which should be obvious, but have been obfuscated by centuries of self-centered human theorizing. Several strands of thought have contributed to a more complex understanding of the relationship between things, humans, and other animals. Let me single out a few of those that this series hopes to present and to bring into dialogue with each other. In anthropology, Philippe Descola has elegantly shown that modern Western cosmology is only one of several existing ways of seeing the world. We tend to hold a naturalistic belief that the physical makeup of different beings is fundamentally similar and universal, based on molecules and metabolisms. Yet their interiorities are different. Snakes and humans are carbon-based life forms, but experience different emotions. Yet there are other ontologies, animism, totemism, and analogism, that posit a different relationship between different kinds of beings. Frédéric Keck, a student of Descola's, has provided one of the most illuminating analyses of the ongoing pandemic based on his study of animal-human interaction in East Asia. He will discuss his work with the microbiologist Stefan Kaufmann in an Einstein Forum event next week, organized jointly with the Berlin Museum of Natural History as part of this series. In science and technology studies, actor network theory and other approaches trace the joint action of assemblages of human and non-human actants, discarding the implicit premise that agency requires a God-given soul or one of its secularized equivalents. In this vein, thinkers such as Michel Calon, Anne-Marie Moll, and Bruno Latour have, for example, looked at the social role of scallops or door hinges, or at fluid technologies such as the Zimbabwe bush pump, which cannot be defined by the intended purpose given to it by a single identifiable creator. In sociology, pragmatist thinkers such as Alain Desrosières, Luc Boltanski, and especially Laurent Thévenot show how all human capacities, including our sense of justice, and our ability to strategize or explore are shaped by our interaction with our material surroundings. They also study how we require material objects endowed with conventionally agreed upon meanings to coordinate action. We value a landscape for its beauty and a dollar bill for its exchange value, not vice versa. When we enter a court of law, we know not to act as if we were in a sauna. And if we don't, eyebrows or guns are raised. Pragmatic sociology has shown how objects create reality tests in social conflict and how they are used to entrench social inequality and domination. Finally, philosophically minded life scientists such as Stefano Mancuso, Alessandra Viola, and Dorothy Crawford have described how non-human animals, microorganisms, and plants are subjects endowed with their own agency and their own mode of thinking, one that is very different, of course, from what thought means for humans. But in many ways, the most impressive contributions to these new ways of thinking about the interaction between humans and non-humans have come from historiography, and specifically from what has become known as the new materialist history, to which both Barak and Alexander Etkind have significantly contributed. Indeed, this new materialism deserves its name much more than its predecessors. Just like the so-called realism in international relations, earlier materialisms were often applications of philosophical idealism. They purported to look at the real world, but hinged on abstractions. Karl Marx defined the value of things through human labor. Indeed, he decried our tendency to ascribe certain inherent qualities to the material products of labor as commodity fetishism. But Marx had little to say about the specific qualities that stuff possesses independently of human labor. He spoke of canvas, wheat, and iron indiscriminately as if their material properties didn't matter. Around the same time, the new science of thermodynamics introduced the concept of energy as an abstraction which, as Barak writes in his book, vaporizes materiality and specificity. Coal, water, sugar, horses, and humans could now be made commensurable with each other. They were no more than repositories of energy. That energy could be quantified, but its material form didn't matter, except for calculating the expenditure involved in converting one form of energy into another. Against such abstract common denominators, the new materialist historiography attends to things as they actually are. It takes into account the physical and chemical properties of peat, wheat, and meat. It considers the horizontal geographical distribution of coal, cod, and cane, and their vertical location relative to the surface of earth and sea. As Alexander Etkind writes in his book, it is a history from below, in the most literal sense of the word below. It studies how all of these characteristics create productive or destructive friction in how these things interact with each other. And it looks at how all of this shapes local and global features of human society. In simplified readings, materialism is frequently portrayed as offering mechanistic, monocausal explanations. The work of the famous political geographer André Siegfried has often been unfairly reduced to the formula granite votes right, limestone votes left. And more recently, Timothy Mitchell's analysis of carbon democracy has been read as deterministic. Coal will always yield social democracy, while oil invariably gives rise to authoritarianism. But the question, as Alexander Etkind writes, is not which comes first, resources or institutions. The relations between them are not cause and effect, but are based on cohabitation, even symbiosis. The new historiography does not seek to deprive humans of their agency by shifting it entirely to non-humans. Instead, it acknowledges humans as part of nature's empire, and thus recognizes the importance of human actions, including deliberate decisions and chance occurrences. Yet it also shows that these actions do not happen in a vacuum, even though learning to create a vacuum artificially was an important step in our interaction with water, petroleum, and the lactation products of our fellow mammals. Nor does the new materialist history treat any single kind of stuff as the sole key to an entire human era, as the older terminology of Bronze or Iron Ages suggested. Cotton did not appear out of nowhere to replace wool overnight. Our own age of oil is still very much an age of coal. Coal, in fact, wonderfully illustrates the sophistication of the new materialism. As Alexander Etkind reminds us in his book, the Dutch Golden Age was fueled by peat, a humid, lightweight, and easily flammable power source. Their rivals in the North Sea trade, the English, developed coal mining to replace scarce timber required by various heat-consuming industries and to become independent from Swedish and Russian wrought iron. Coal is heavy and thus difficult to transport across long distances, so cities arose near coal mines. Coal extraction is dangerous, difficult to automate, and requires teamwork. The resulting solidarity meant that coal miners were among the first to organize and demand collective rights. The first steam engines were developed to pump water out of coal mines. A century later, they would power the first trains proceeding along tracks built to ship coal to port cities and other urban centers. They also created steamships sturdy enough to export heavy British coal overseas, creating the global infrastructure for a trade in which sugar, tobacco, and cotton from the North American colonies increased their competitive advantage over European and especially East Asian rivals. Because steamers became lighter as they consumed their heavy coal fuel, they also used coal-powered technology to draw seawater as ballast, incidentally increasing global biodiversity by spreading maritime species far from their original habitats. One of the many unexpected insights from Barak's book. In order to desalinate that water for use in steam production and drinking, the British developed coal-based condensers. Those, in turn, helped concentrate access to water in arid regions in the hands of a small elite. Thus, the very coal that gave rise to social democracy in Europe fostered authoritarian control in a region which, as a result of the British coal trade, became the Middle East. So I would like to structure our discussion tonight as a series of parallel questions to each of you. And I would also like to inform the audience that you're also very welcome to ask your own questions. However, I would ask you not to type them in the chat because that is very disruptive because they're visible immediately to everyone. Instead, please use the Q&A box that you can all see at the bottom of your screens. And once we are done with the first round of discussion among the three of us, we will take your questions from the Q&A, read them aloud, and reply to them. So let me start with a pair of questions for both of you, Alexander and On, about how you envisage the relationship between different resources if we abandon the idea that every age is defined by one resource only. Each of you offers a striking metaphor for this. So, Alexander, your book introduces the elegant concept of a mercantile pump. Could you talk a little bit about what is being pumped here and with what consequences?
Well, Misha, thanks a lot for this introduction, and I'm really pleased that you picked from my book a concept that is hidden somewhere in the middle, but I cherish it. I think there is something to this idea of the pump, as you said, Misha, in order to pump out something like water or oil, we're creating a vacuum, so that the first vacuum pump was created by Robert Boyle, made of copper, and I talk a lot in my book about this copper, because one of the ideas of my book, in fact, is that history of science and history of technology is talking, and also economic history talks a lot about creative labor, inventions, technologies, scientific discoveries, but somehow underappreciates the raw material from which, say, this vacuum pump was made of. It was made actually of a Swedish copper, which is, I was really pleased to find out that it came from one particular copper mine in central Sweden, which was partially owned by the Swedenborg family. And Emanuel Swedenborg was indeed a mine engineer who came to his own ideas of vibration and piping and all that during the decades of work in the mining industry. All right, so mercantile pump, it's a kind of social mechanism, unlike that vacuum pump. It's a social mechanism that converts non-tradable resources into tradable goods. And what does it mean to convert? For instance, peasants work on land and live on land and eat meat and milk and vegetables and corn, which they grow on land. But that is called sustainable economies. They cannot trade because they have no surplus. So anybody who comes to this land as a feudal or merchant wants to get something else. For instance, wool. So the long historical process, it's called in history, it's called enclosures, started. That the owners of new lords, new owners of land, displaced cows on the on the village meadows, and later also displaced corn by sheep, because only sheep could turn grass into gold, meaning the tradable thing that could be transported far away, proceeded and sold for basically for hard currency, for silver. So this is what mercantile pump does. It converts something which is raw and heavy and non-tradable into something, into another, deeply other thing, which is dry, usable, and transportable.
And also addictive. That to me was one of the really interesting insights from the sort of longue durée aspect of your book, where you show that subsistence economy, which was the condition of life for most people throughout most of history, was sort of exploded by the influx of all these addictive things like sugar, coffee, which left everyone craving for more and more and more, and which really kind of started this movement of progress and acceleration that we're talking about so much now.
Yeah, all these addictive substances, from tea to opium, which really determined the trade through centuries. That also includes spices, chocolate, tobacco, and much else. And they all create addiction, and their trade is based on this kind of growing consumption. So I basically define addiction this way, that this is a process in which production defines consumption. It's not that consumption defines production, as economists tell us. And that works for many products of labor, but for many tradable commodities, for many primary commodities, that works in the opposite way. The more is available, the more would be consumed. And that really reverts the whole logic of political economy, I would say.
Right. And yeah, and among many other things, I was fascinated by how your book also engages with the entire history of economic thought and really adds some very unexpected insights to it. Maybe we'll get back to that later. So your book is structured by several no less striking metaphors. And one of them is that of British coal trade in the 19th century as a gigantic terraforming octopus. I really loved that metaphor, but also the image that you used to illustrate it from a mid-19th century book, which actually shows this octopus on a map of the world and also shows that its tentacles were so thick that Africa had to be reduced in size simply to be able to fit it into a map. So how does this zoomorphic image help us understand the interaction between coal, water, and non-octopodic creatures in your story?
Well, so thanks, Misha, and let me first try to show this in a very low-tech fashion. What I'm trying to show is Charles-Joseph Minard's portrayal of the British coal export from 1864. Minard is well, the grandfather of infographics, and what he's doing in the 1860s is trying to combine a graph and a map and to illustrate the flow, and I mean that quite literally to your question, the flow of British coal. So the direction of the trade, the direction of the export is demarcated by the direction of the line, and the quantity of coal exported is demarcated by the width of the line. And when he steps back from this statistical attempt at doing cartography, he discovers that this looks like a giant squid. And I indeed, latch onto it as a very powerful metaphor for the flow of coal, and I insist on using that word because, as you point out, Minard has to make several selections. For example, in order to indicate the maritime nature of this export, he needs to widen the Straits of Gibraltar so that the body of the octopus has a place to. There's simply too much coal to leave the Straits of Gibraltar intact. And there's a clash between what I see as a statistical realism and a cartographical realism. And I think statistics emerges as a powerful force in this moment in the 19th century, although it has an older history. But as a way of thinking about flows, it overrides much of how we look at the world. And the octopus, for me, is a very useful creature for several respects. First, it's a maritime creature, and it helps kind of introduce the oceanic turn and the fact that much of the action in my work happens is maritime, and much of global capitalism, more than 90% today, but increasingly from the 19th century, travels overseas. And I think rather than looking at the sea as a barrier, people in the 19th century begin to see it as a connector, and the octopus does that. It helps introduce what might be seen as a vertical turn, or the importance of verticality, of depth, of something, of things that are submerged, that happen underwater or underground. And that level, that dimension is important in my attempt to kind of follow coal in these various places. And it also helps to think about empire as a creature whose tentacles are smarter than its central brain. The octopus has more neurons in the tentacles than it has in the central, unit of processing, and empires are very often like that. And of course, speaking of, apropos your introduction to new materialism, it's a homage to Donna Haraway's notion of the Cthulhu, the kind of the octopus-like god, which stands for the Anthropocene, which is a better kind of rendition of the Anthropocene, being a result of emissions spewed from burning coal. So all of these things and several others are served by this monster. And monsters are something Alexandra and I seem to share a fascination with. So that's my hero. That's my sea monster.
What I found really interesting about this is that it's not just an octopus that kind of spreads its tentacles along existing waterways. It also carves new ones, right? So from the first canal that links Alexandria to the Nile, which is dug also in connection with the incipient coal trade, right, to the Suez Canal, and it changes the complete infrastructure and also the complete kind of human and marine ecology around these places, right? And the coal trade that passes through the Middle East really kind of transforms everything, right? It leads paradoxically actually to an increase in things like sailboats and camels and horses, where usually one thinks of coal and steam as replacing all of these things, but actually you show that initially over the first decades, there's much more of them because they're all needed as kind of feeders and an infrastructure, right, to create all of this. And then it also changes the whole sort of the geography of, you know, which cities are important, all the way to creating entirely new cities like Bursaid, right? And then it also creates the whole Middle East. I mean, basically, following your book, the Middle East is the result of this octopus. It wouldn't exist otherwise.
Yeah, I suggest in several places that the Middle East is a result of an artificial archipelago of these coaling depots in evenly spaced intervals in, you know, Gibraltar, Malta, Port Said, Aden, Bombay, that help to coal, to fuel these moving steamers, and that gradually allow to replace the long circumnavigation of Africa with sail ships, with this kind of coal-fired, coal-fueled movement through what becomes, in the process, the Middle East. So the term Middle East is coined after this geography is, this artificial geography is created.
Right. So this actually brings me to my next set of questions, which is about geography. So about 15 years ago, the editors of Eurozine asked me if I could recommend a recent Russian author who had written a history of the world from a Russian perspective. And at the time, the only such authors that I could think of were nationalists who portrayed all of global history as a vast conspiracy against Russia. And now, Alexandra, I can safely point to your book, which has a truly planetary perspective, but also one that includes Russia in this global history, where it has often been neglected, right? Very often in the recent kind of global turn, people talk about the global south and interactions between the global north and the global south. But what used to be called the second world, right, northern Eurasia, is often kind of erased out of the picture. And I'm wondering how you would summarize the specifically Russian aspect of your story, but also how you see the contribution of a cultural history of resources to an understanding of Russia.
Well, Russia is, par excellence, it's specifically the country of natural resources. There is not much mystery about that because it's just a very big country, and the more space you have, particularly terrestrial space, but I think it also applies to the sea, to the surface. But the more space you have, the more you find there. As simple as that. So in my story, of course, Russia has been exporting tradable materials through and through, from the 10th century when it was all about fur, and particular kind of fur, to, up to now when it is all about oil. And we know bits and pieces, but of course I tried to reconstruct the whole itinerary. And I had in mind, I want to own about that. I had in mind this idea, I call it the resource platform. I had in mind this image of temporary but long-term specialization of a particular region, particular space, particular country, as we would say now, on a certain resource, and then say on fur in the medieval Russia. And then either because this particular kind of fur, say sable, was exterminated, or alternatively because it lost demand, because obviously export trade needs demand. This demand is, depends on some non-controllable factors. So then the whole kind of business of the whole country, the resource platform, collapses, and that leads to what I call kind of generalizing from a particular moment of Russian history. I call it the time of troubles. So the collapse of resource platform leads to the time of troubles. More or less the same thing happened for other empires as well. Say, a big story of the British Empire was the story of sugar, this kind of addictive substance. And this addiction was growing, it had no limit for growth. But then some German chemists, they were essentially 18th century kind of late alchemists. They invented beet sugar. And this beet sugar made such huge wound to the British imperial economy. And I was pleased to see that it was not just a scientific discovery, it was purposefully encouraged by Frederick the Great, by some kind of great rulers of the time who saw that they cannot beat the British Empire. They cannot beat the Royal Navy, but they can beat the cane sugar. So this idea of the periodical change, dramatic, catastrophic changes of a resource platform from one to another, which goes through kind of time of civil war, revolution, misery, and then a country acquires a new point, a new platform for the further developments. That was my kind of imagery of development, which was more like a serpentine, like a road which goes up through a mountain. It never goes straight. In one's work, that if I can ask this question already, I think that you are trying to kind of to get rid of this idea of, say, energy transition. If we are talking about energy, you kind of try to establish a new way of imagining this sort of this particular development. What kind of what is that? Is it just a gradual expansion in your mind that sort of absorbs the previous materials, the previous platforms, and goes like a building, one level, second level, it goes up, also having no limit. We still have kind of complex itinerary, which could be your work makes me think that this sort of development, the very image could be different, say, for consumables such as sugar or energy such as coal and oil, or there is something different in play here.
Yeah, Misha, you make a face as if you want to say something.
No, I make an encouraging face.
Okay, that's your encouraging face. Yeah, Alexandra, I think this is an interesting tension in our approaches, and I would I think it's a matter of stress, of where one stresses or how one chooses between rupture and continuity, and I'm ashamed to admit here that I opt for the continuity. This is the more conservative, methodological maneuver, and it's not something to be very proud of. And reading your account of shifts between resource platforms, there's obviously a great deal of insight to be gleaned by attending to ruptures. But I think that especially in the story of energy, there is also a price. And the price is that we tend to fetishize these breaks and assume, for example, that we are now in a post-oil moment, that coal, say, is the energy of the past, or we tend to tell a story that begins with renewables, with hydropower the powers of winds and waves and animals, renewables, and then that is supplanted by the age of fossil fuels. First coal is supplanted by oil, and according to some accounts, we are in a post-oil moment. But of course, we have yet to see an energy transition in a full sense of the word. We now burn more coal than we did in the 19th century. Actually, also the powers that coal supposedly replaced are accumulating. So thinking, and I made a reference earlier to statistics overriding how we look at the world. And this is exactly one of these places, because in relative terms, coal, of course, there are, of course, energy transitions or resource platform shifts. And the role of coal in the pie, in the general pie of energy sources is declining rapidly, which might give us a source for optimism. But if we look at the question through the eyes of the planet, as it were, through Gaia's eyes, in total terms, we burn more coal. It's my account is a way of kind of countering this optimism that emerges from the shifts, from the transitions discourse. And I think something to be gained here, if I take up your examples of sugar and energy, is that we tell a story of addiction. I mean, both you and I are interested in the phenomenon that can be rendered fossil fuels addiction, addictions to coal, addictions to oil. But I have a sense, and I actually want to turn this into a question to you, that you use addiction in two different senses. And you just previously gave a general account of how you see addiction, but there still seems to be a categoric difference between addiction to sugar, to which you bring a predisposed body, and an addiction to oil, for which you need to construct a world, say, that separates your place of work from your place of residence and forces you to travel, to commute. And by looking at the question of addiction, shunning away the notion of energy transitions, one can connect sugar, an addiction to sugar, an addiction to opium, an addiction to tea, and an addiction to coal, like I'm trying to do, for example, by showing that the habit of coal is the result of the tea races in the 1860s, or the trade in opium, which imposes seasonality on a trade that would benefit from year-round transportation, which is coal-fired because initially sail ships need to abide by the monsoon, by the seasons, and the all-weather ship, the steamer, can traverse the sea even in the monsoon. So the payoff, if you will, in the notion of addiction that's so central to your work, that if you bracket or shun these shifts in resource platforms and look together at several resources, you get, I think, a less metaphorical definition, a more corporeal notion of how addiction works, even to coal, even to fossil fuels, even to energy.
Well, we're social beings, right? And sugar, of course, is a matter of very individual consumption. Let's say opium, or basically any drug. But if you think about that, sugar as well, much depends on social examples, on the network to which I belong. What other people do, and this kind of drug addictions, they spread like epidemics. We know about that. It's different, but though it is very different for different drugs. Or in our case, in my case, I include also very innocent substance like sugar into this category of soft drugs. But then, of course, I like you, I want to expand this idea of addiction also to energy. things like, for me, of course, it's more evident when we're talking about petrol. I'm also a driver, you know, but obviously, you know, we get this habit and skill and taste because of the social environment, which also includes advertisement, you know, films, role models, all this high culture that promotes particular kind of behavior, like, say, Americanization of European consumption in the post World War II Europe, which was very purposeful, you know, creating the demand for oil, for more petrol, more cars, longer distances for driving, etc. So I also apply the same logic, say, I mean, the same but also different logic for the expansion of expansion of cotton. We're always talking about capitalism. Even if when we're talking about socialism, it was not that much different in this particular area, because it was the development is the expansion of demand, and how to create this, how to expand the demand. When a particular group of people kind of refused to consume or did not grow their demand, people were in trouble. Like economists were talking about, you know, how to change that, how to undermine that, how to improve that, how to facilitate demand. So for cotton, of course, that's the mechanism which is similar to addiction, but different is fashion. So, you know, I could possibly wear this shirt for very long, but I will not, because the fashion will change. So I will, you know, throughout my life, I will change my shirts much more often than, you know, I need, the environment would tolerate, etc.
Okay, while you're chewing on this one, actually, I want to get to another point of potential disagreement between the two of you. But before doing that, I want to stay just a little bit with geography, right? So we talked about the importance of Russia, in a sense, and I want to ask you on a similar question with regard to the Middle East, right? So when we consider the historic importance of coal, we usually think of places like Lancaster or Lille, Duisburg or Donetsk, and of course, Pennsylvania or Queensland, not Egypt or Yemen, right? And you've already talked a little bit about how the Middle East as a coherent region was actually, and I think, you know, unexpectedly for most of us, shaped by coal, more coal trade than coal extraction. And maybe you could expand a little bit about that. But also, could you tell us, why should non-Middle Easterners care about this, right? I mean, the subtitle of your book mentions not only how coal created the Middle East, but also how this sparked global carbonization. So what is kind of the importance of your particular region for this global moment that we're in? And Alexander, if you want to add to that from a Russian perspective, I mean, your book also ends with a really interesting analysis of Russia, but also other countries like Venezuela as petrostates that have a very strong impact on global politics and the global environment based on how they are pumping resources out of their countries with relatively scant regard for their own populations, for anyone else, really. So I think this is a good platform to make more people care about your respective regions based on your analysis of the materials that are so important to these regions.
Right. So you said, Misha, that in the context of coal, people don't think about the Middle East and they think about Pennsylvania or Manchester. And usually when they think about the Middle East, they automatically think about this region vis-a-vis oil. So one intervention that I'm trying to make here is to show that you cannot understand oil in the Middle East and elsewhere without understanding coal. That much of the story of oil the 20th century rests on the shoulders or rides on the tentacles of that prehistory of coal, and that so in a limited sense, to understand the Middle East and to understand oil, and as far as oil is important beyond the Middle East, you need to understand the export of coal from the British Isles to it. But indeed, this story or this process of exporting British coal to the Middle East is what I claim is the origins of global carbonization. We constantly talk about decarbonization as the horizon we should all aspire to, but we do not yet have a history of carbonization, of how the hydrocarbon economy went global. And I think one of its key engines is this connection I play with calling it colonialism, this connection of energy and empire, a connection of British imperialism and the export of the Industrial Revolution and its main energy source or driving force. And in that sense, the export of British coal to the Middle East then creates this extractive impulse in the Middle East, in places like modern-day Turkey, but also across the Indian Ocean, in China, in India, these very places, by the way, where we still see a rise in the consumption of coal today. So again, through the eyes of the planet, of Gaia, of the Anthropocene, and insisting on east-east connections or south-south connections, we, I think, need to read the Middle East into the history of global carbonization in a much earlier point. It doesn't start in the 20th century with oil, but 100 years previously.
Now to petrostates.
Yeah, this is a story to me. This is very much a story of how natural resources create geography. We understand that, you know, geography contains natural resources, and the random, like contingent character of say coal. There is coal in one place, there is no coal in many other places. The same applied to, you know, things like silk or particular kinds of timber or particular kinds of whatever, diamonds, or of course oil. So this is the natural basis for trade. So those things are tradable, which are rare. What does it mean to be rare? It means that they were and they are available in one particular spot on Earth and not available on another spot. Therefore, this latter spot would buy. What does it mean to buy? So that means that this latter spot also have to produce something tradable in exchange. This is the story which historically translates into the stories of imperial expansion from one particular spot, say from the English Isles to India, looking for particular kind of resources. First, whatever it was, spices, then it was tea, then it was cotton, etc. And in Russia, there's huge expanse. So I said that Russia has so many resources because it is big. But in fact, the opposite would be more true. Russia is big because the Russian authorities and the Russian people as well, to some extent, they were seeking resources. They were expanding their space onto the east, into Siberia. They also, you know, took it all the way to Alaska. And the only attraction there, the only thing that drove that expansion was fur. One kind of fur, then another kind of fur, then the third kind of fur. And that makes an interesting story. Russia is not unique. A very symmetrical case was Canada. And that's well researched. There are some classical studies by Harold Innes on that, which were kind of an example for my work on Siberia. But I think that also was the case for Middle East. Of course, is very different because there are many countries, and not that many different resources. Basically, one or two or maybe three, but many countries that sort of developed in an interesting kind of mosaic way. Also, of course, that was this kind of imperial colonial interests coming from very different parts of the world. So what I'm trying to say is that this idea of kind of monotonous expansion is just one version of this kind of looking for resources and managing the imperial space for this purpose. There were some other mechanisms which I think only you could tell us much more about than I could, because they belong to your part of the world, these mechanisms.
So what are you referring to exactly, Alexander?
Just compare Siberia to the Middle East. So the Siberia is all Canada. So this is one big space, pretty much uniform, which was historically acquired, colonized, gotten because of this drive, looking for food, for sables.
Yeah.
It's a simple story. But say Saudi Arabia and and the Marshals and Yemen and and a dozen of other countries. So they have something, they don't have something. There are this kind of contingent borders. Obviously, it's very different story from Siberia. Entirely different. Still, I'm sure it is still connected to interaction between natural resources and imperial powers, distant powers, but also local interests.
Yeah, I mean, the boundaries and the borders of Middle Eastern states were drawn by, so it's not the story of Russia created by sable and Canada created by beaver, but the creation of France and England. And these creations, of course, had a lot to do with underground geographies, with the fact that oil is a liquid, and therefore it promotes a certain mode of territorializing states and creating borders and property rights. Right? You have, for example, to give ownership in the underground to the state. Otherwise, an oil corporation invests a great deal in research and development and finds the oil, and then someone plucks a straw from the other side of the property or of the bound or of the border and sucks it all out. For sure, the materiality of resources has a lot to do with the creation of borders, but to tell that story, one needs to introduce the fact of empire, of other empires, of foreign empires, which I think what makes the Middle East an interesting case of attending to resources, because it's a kind of a two-layered or a slightly more complicated story of nature's evil. It's a nature's evil mediated by human evil or by political evil. So it removes us, it brackets nature or the underground or the resource. And maybe that is one way also to answer your previous question about the centrality of resource platforms for you or for me. And of course, it opens up a different kind of politics, of coal, of oil, which is at once geopolitical and materialist or resource centered.
All right, we're already getting questions in the Q&A, including a fascinating one that involves sheep castration. But before getting to those questions, and everybody is encouraged to ask more, I would like to ask a final one for both of you, touching upon a central point on which I detect some disagreement between your two books. So Alexander's conclusion, and you both talk, of course, especially towards the end, about kind of the looming or ongoing environmental catastrophe. But Alexander's conclusion is that human environmental self-destruction can only be stopped through some global regulatory mechanism, right? Otherwise, free riders will always be able to circumvent the system to bolster their competitive advantage. That sounds like a solution in the spirit of progress, right? Your conclusion is that deceleration and even laziness and foot dragging might actually sometimes be better solutions. So I'm wondering to what extent these two solutions are compatible, and of course, how each of them will get everyone to do the right thing and decrease their consumption of animal products.
Well, I still believe in the progress, but just what do we mean by this word? It has been changing, at least every decade, through the 20th century and until now. So free riders, kind of deceleration. We're talking about a change of life, of this lifestyle for millions, for billions of people. How would they do that? For instance, we believe that, I think on and I, we agree about vegetarianism. And, that is, this is probably one of the best proven points in all these anthropocenic studies, that without shifting to vegetarian food or maybe even vegan food, climate change will just destroy humanity. So we have to do that. But how? How can you do that in a democratic society? Would people vote for this particular program? People who are, properly and deeply addicted, say, to meat or to cow milk, or to other substances that we want, and to petrol, of course, that we want to eliminate. In a democratic society, it sounds kind of doubtful. Should we start discussing some kind of authoritarian programs? Authoritarian programs, if they're contained by a nation state, of course, we have this idea of utility of a nationalist, of an isolated reconstruction. So I do believe in kind of global governance on this sort of in a very futuristic ways that we basically either do not know, we are kind of looking for that. We can imagine that. We can calculate some models. Some other people are doing this for us. I do not, frankly, and also the experience of pandemic that we have right now, all of us, has strengthened my feeling that an individual, an average individual, or even the best of us, we are not able to regulate our lives according to whatever high principles that we have, even according to our best interest, if this interest is not immediate. That means that someone else should regulate that for us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure food dragging or laziness are my solution with a capital S. I'm just trying to be useful and use the story I tell as a usable past, and to extract in it, or to recycle from it, useful insights for the present. But these are not necessarily the solution or the single solution. But I think this past has several important things to teach us. And one of them, and here might be a friction with Alexander, is that we I think, must look for solutions in existing platforms, in existing infrastructures. We don't have time for utopianism. And another insight, perhaps, is that optimism, perhaps, is not the disposition that would lead us out of this gridlock. Techno-optimism was what threw us into it. And perhaps other affects, other emotions, fear, the solidarity that emerges from fatalism, from religiosity. So these are things that the past can, resources that the past can offer for thinking about, for looking for solutions to a problem that's global in nature, and that needs to be articulated in languages that are not only English, in ideologies that are not only liberal, but these are not the kind of the sum of all solutions that I offer. I've just been reading Kim Stanley Robinson's, the science fiction author's new book, The Ministry for the Future. And there he proposes a solution that's actually similar to Alexander's, but a more bureaucratic one, or one grounded in the Paris Accords of 2015, and in kind of the UN bureaucracies, so grounding our utopianisms in existing institutions and translating them to more diverse and broader set of ethics, affective dispositions, languages, and historical experiences is a necessary starting point. I don't have anything beyond the starting point.
All right, maybe we'll be able to get back to that a little later, but I do want to take one question now, which comes from the Einstein Forum's Deputy Director, Martin Schad, and I will just read it out. He writes, as much as I enjoyed the metaphorical allusions or visualizations on Barak's octopus and Alexander Etkind's Mercantile pump, please allow me to offer a comment which is as heretic as it is perhaps naive. It concerns the question of agency of stuff, or indeed of animals. The general idea that the availability of specific resources, commodities, or even animals has an effect on the economic and by extension social and political development of human societies is an idea that I can easily understand, that I find interesting and worth exploring. The extension of this idea that the stuff and those animals found by humans to be available or scarce, tradable, transportable, useful, producible at all, constitutes agency, is something that I find very difficult to wrap my head around. Alexander Etkind, for example, has referred to the enclosures ending subsistence farming in England and, above all, in Scotland, with sheep turning grass into gold, meaning tradable wool. Having worked for a while on a Highland sheep estate, the agency of sheep just eludes me. I castrated more than 2,000 male lambs. I have to confess, I saw no agency. So what would the two of you say to that?
Well, I write a lot about these issues in my book, because I really claim that all this, including a piece of coal or a barrel of oil, or of course, a sack of wool, all this, even inanimate things, are agents. They have their own agency, which I basically imagine as a combination of these unique natural qualities, physical, chemical, biological, if they're organic, and geographical. Things grow in one place, they do not grow in another. Something, is fluid, something is firm, etc. So the combination of that is unique. It doesn't mean that these things have soul or anima or emotions or anything like that. Obviously, Bruno Latour was struggling with the same issue on a grander scale. He says that Gaia is an organism, but it doesn't have a soul. It's kind of subject, it's an agent, but it doesn't have a soul. Therefore, a sheep, even if you castrate it, and this sheep didn't give any consent for doing that. Sheep does have emotions, but we don't care about these emotions. But we do care about its wool, its quality, its weight, its whatever, its color, and much more. And the more you know about that, the more different qualities of sheep you differentiate. Basically, this is my understanding of natural agency.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that the question is how we define agency. And there's a long list of philosophers, Foucault being the most famous, who downplay how much humans have agency. The closing the gap between humans and sheep can come from that direction as well. But as long as we don't define agency as something synonymous to reflexivity or soul, then I think we're okay. I think the question raises another question, which is the question of anthropocentrism, which is, I think, a very pressing issue. Need we necessarily abandon anthropocentrism, or should we, in fact, take the reverse course and go, put anthropocentrism on steroids, insist that humans are a special category of nature, and especially if we're looking for solutions, so the sheep don't read our books, and just in terms of demarcating our sphere of effectivity, thinking of the problem of the human in the Anthropocene as the only creature who can make a difference, even while not being the center, the paragon of creation, is, I think, a more challenging concern of what to do with anthropocentrism. Do we necessarily kind of throw it as the Latours and others are trying to do, and the Latours and the Haraways, or are we going with a strand of neo-Marxists like Andreas Malm or like Clive Hamilton, insisting that we need to kind of introduce a new anthropocentrism? I think that is a related question that is quite pressing.
So maybe if I may also chip in, since I think that the question also concerns my introduction at the beginning of the event. I mean, I think one way of thinking about this is that Martin's inability to see the agency of the sheep that he was castrating is not entirely unrelated to the inability of anyone in a position of power to see the agency of the subaltern, right? And I mean, in Alexander Etkind's book, there are lots of really interesting analytical observations about how over centuries, peasants were always seen as lazy, precisely because the particular qualities most adapted to subsistence farming and a kind of natural moral economy were completely opaque to those who believed in efficiency, in the benefits of trade, etc. So that, you know, as a result, peasants and slaves and others whose kind of fruits of labor were then pumped into this global economy were seen as dumb, lazy, and, you know, deprived of any kind of agency. But my second answer would be that, you know, the kind of increasingly I find it difficult to understand how we are often still unable to see the agency of non-humans. Because, I mean, really the only distinguishing feature that would allow us to attribute agency only to humans has these really peculiar religious roots, and roots not just in religion as a whole, but in, you know, particular kinds of monotheistic religions that posit that, you know, there's a God that made us in his image and endowed us with a soul, which is exactly what Philippe Descola analyzes as this kind of modern Western naturalism, right? It's the interiority of humans that sets them apart, this kind of an unfathomable interiority where just based on our own experience, we are completely convinced that we must be the only ones who can think, feel, and act, right? But as soon as we kind of step a little bit away from that and we see that agency is just, you know, the ability to affect any kind of change in the world, not necessarily as a result of sort of, you know, purposeful sort of human brain-based planning, then I think it becomes really entirely obvious that there is also agency in other actors. And anyway, that's one of the main premises of this series. I wanted to, I think I lost that question in the Q&A, but I think Susan Neiman, the director of the Einstein Forum, wanted to ask a question about the ethical dimension, which I think follows really well on this discussion that we just had. So, Alexander, your book, among other things, is also a natural history of evil, right? So it's called Nature's Evil in the two senses of that formula. And you do talk a lot about how there is a very strong moral dimension to this history of natural resources. And, you know, there are certain configurations and certain ways of dealing with these resources that create a lot of evil in the world, right? So your materialism is not one that kind of outsources the question of morality. And I detect a kind of a similar maybe impulse in your writing, although it's more meandering, perhaps. But you also want to kind of resurrect certain maybe alternative moralities in thinking about how we deal with resources. So what is the sort of the moral lesson that we can learn from your materialist look at history, both of you?
Well, that's a very, very long story, you know, as long as my book. But the most radical way to put it is recognizing the. So once again, if this all these things like a barrel of oil if it is an agent, so it should be all these bits and pieces and these huge masses of natural resources. They all should be included in our moral equation. If to imagine it or formalize it as in a utilitarian way. So that's, you know, this sum of pleasures minus sum of sufferings should also include these assumed responses on the part of non-human agents. And I think this is what actually we will do, and what the economists that are trying to bring us forward are trying to do, say, with all these carbon taxes, you know, fines, and the kind of this new ways of quantification of basically of punishing us for overconsumption, say by carbon tax, overconsumption of oil, and supporting that oil or that cow or that sheep to, you know, to prosper in the future.
So one could frame it also as a moral duty, maybe, to fellow beings.
I think it's more than that. It's kind of it's a recognition of their moral agency, of their moral partnership, which is fine, which is trivial when we're talking about humans. It's kind of challenging if we're talking about animals, particularly for a meat eater. It's unacceptable, and it's kind of strange if we're talking about oil or coal.
So, building on that strangeness, let me give an example from my book, which has to do with how the Ottomans and how Muslims more generally think about the subsoil, following translations from French to Arabic to Ottoman Turkish of stratigraphy, one notices how through these acts of translation, two things are found in translation or are added to European stratigraphy in translation to Turkish and Arabic. One is the notion of tabakat, which is the analogy between cohorts of scholars and generations in general, and the strata of the ground. If you want, humanizing or anthropomorphizing the underground in ways that push towards investing minerals or earth with human property and with ethical property. And that is reinforced by the second maneuver, or the second term, which is rikaz, the notion of buried treasure, the fact that coal and oil and other minerals are deposits that God puts in the underground for the benefits of the entire community, and that if we extract them and if we use them, this needs to adhere to a very elaborate set of ethical rules, including, for example, counting generations in the future, something that Alexander also develops along the notion of cohort equity. Taking into account future generations by thinking about mineralogy and stratigraphy and the underground, by thinking about the material, and by thinking of material as invested in ethics, is exactly one potential, maybe even taking us around the issue of agency. But resources have ethics, or they radiate a certain kind of ethics, and they direct humans to handle them ethically. And this is something that's part and parcel of this process of global carbonization. We're talking about cultures and political entities, the Ottoman Empire being one, that are part of global carbonization. They are, if we are assigning blame, they have lesser blame than the British Empire, but they share some of the blame. But in being complicit, they also offer these potentials of rethinking matter and collapsing or kind of eroding the divide between ethics and matter, and thinking of matter as something that pulsates or radiates with ethics that we can then use or redeploy or learn from or draw inspiration from as we look for alternative models of handling our resources, our fossil fuels, and so on.
All right. So I don't know if it's a problem with the Q&A function, but I'm not seeing any more questions. And unless anyone from the audience wants to add add anything. I want to end maybe on another sort of future-oriented question, which is what are your next plans in terms of materialism or materialist history? Which objects, which things, what kind of stuff are you currently interested in, and why do you think it's important? And
well,
for you, yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about a more empirical study of decarbonization as it goes now, if it goes now in Eastern Europe, also in the Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, Poland. I'm thinking about a kind of study that would address the situation now or in the coming years, because these are obviously crucial years. This post-pandemic green recovery, as the European Union chose to call it, and it needs monitoring and investigation. And I believe that my sort of moral material context gives a perfect framework for this study.
So my new project, I'm not sure it neatly falls under this new materialism. It's a history of heat. It's a history of heat in the Middle East, a region that's known as a hotspot, and that in its history develops various modes of heat resistance and adapting to heat, and gives us examples of how people respond to heat, the connection of heat and violence. And also, it's an attempt on my side, on my part, to move away from fossil fuels. Just to give a quick example, air conditioning, which in the region consumes growing amounts of electricity. In Saudi Arabia, 70% of electricity, of fossil-fueled electricity, goes to air conditioning. But the introduction of air conditioners into the region has a fascinating cultural history. Air conditioners entered the region through cinemas, on the wings of films like Gone with the Wind. And they inculcated new dispositions to sweat, to body odor, to erotic attraction. So trying to kind of think about the Anthropocene not only through fossil fuels, but through the body, through erotics, through the senses, is a different kind of materialism, I suppose.
That is a wonderful project. And I have to say, sitting in the cold Berlin winter in the middle of a pandemic, thinking about heat and erotic attraction in the Middle East is really making me feel optimistic. So wonderful. Many thanks to both of you. I think this was a wonderful inaugural discussion for our series. And I hope it will continue in interesting, unpredictable kind of octopod ways in the future. And maybe, the meandering road of the series will lead us to another conversation in this configuration or another. So yeah, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for attending and for listening. And I hope to see both of you very soon.
Looking forward to that. Thank you, Misha. Thank you, On.
Me too. Thanks, Misha. Thanks, Alexander. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.